Hello, my name is Andrew Grassie. I'm an artist that works with egg tempera. I make small paintings, usually from photographs that I either take myself or from found imagery.
Right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us tonight. My name is Daniel Herman. I'm the curator of modern and contemporary projects here at the National Gallery. And I'm delighted that tonight we're going to be working with you, with our audience, and with Andrew Grassie, I think, one of the most interesting artists working in Britain at the time. And that's exactly what we're about. Tonight, what we're doing is not a regular historical talk about our collection. We're not going to go into the art historical depths of the paintings, but instead this is actually part of our Unexpected View series of talks, where we get together some of Britain's most interesting artists today and have the opportunity to really talk about what makes artists interested in our paintings. Why are these artworks that we have on the wall that have been in existence for 600 and more years, why are they relevant and how are they relevant to artists today? So that's the opportunity that we're trying to create. For that, I always have to say we're also very grateful to our sponsors, Hiscox, the insurance company, who is enabling us to do these talks. So that's always worth a mention. Thank you very much. We are really delighted that you have made it here. Of course, after a couple of not just difficult months, but difficult years, it's even more important than ever for us to get back together and actually to be able to do this in person. We will have our discussion for about, let's say, maybe half an hour or so that we don't get too boring for you. But then after that, it becomes really interesting when we actually also get to do a little bit of a Q&A with you, hear your questions, maybe even give answers, and just see what you have to say about things as well. So hopefully we'll be able to do that. Now, this is my chance to introduce Andrew, which is a real joy to me because Andrew Grassie is an artist whose career I've been following since I started in the United Kingdom as a curator myself. Andrew is born in 1966. He was actually born in Edinburgh in Scotland, where I also started, hence a bit of mutual interests there. Andrew studied at St. Martin's School of Art in London for his bachelor's in painting. He did a MA in painting at the Royal College of Art in 1988. And he also very quickly after that, and for several years until now, is a consistent winner of art awards, of painting awards. Among them, for instance, the John Coble New Work Award, the John Moores Prize, the Special Merit at the Walker Art Gallery at the John Moores Prize, and many others. There are several solo shows that Andrew has had in the past years. Among them, the collected works of Andrew at the Rennie Collection in Vancouver, Painting as Document at the Talbot Rice Gallery in Edinburgh, and there's a very exciting upcoming solo show of Andrew's work at the at Maureen Paley Gallery in November of this year. All something to look forward to. I hope we will see you there. But there's also been recent group shows. Among them, just recently, a Century of the Artist Studio at the Whitechapel Gallery here in London, where you might have encountered Andrew's work, and also an exhibition called Proposition for an Infinite Garden at the Government Art Collection here in London. And that's where things become also quite interesting for me, because that's where I actually encountered your work for the first time, when I was working on an exhibition together with the Government Art Collection, the specialist collection for government institutions, government buildings in the United Kingdom. And I was trying to put a show together that illustrates what makes that very specialist service collection very unique and usual, and find artworks that expresses that. And among the artworks that I saw were these photographs of interior spaces that I found absolutely enticing. Among them, a photograph of number 10 Downing Street, or at least the pillared room of number 10 Downing Street. And this photograph had this decorated room that was slightly naffly decorated, but with wonderful paintings on the walls. And there was a trestle table that had been half dismounted, and there seemed to be a whiteboard on the wall. So somebody had apparently just had a brainstorm meeting in there, to kind of lay it on the floor. And I looked at it and I tried to find out, is it a table? Is it a wait a second. And I noticed, well, it was actually not a photograph, but instead it was a painting. It was a painting that you can see in front of you now on the illustrations. Both works that are represented in the government art collection by Andrew are actually tempera paintings, roughly, not quite, but roughly at the same size as the printout.
They're roughly the same size as the printout, as I can see. They're about a large postcard. In fact, the one the government, the number 10 Downing Street is actually about 20% smaller than the one that's printed out. So you'll have to use your imagination. But,
exactly. But it was this gem-like quality of the painting, the real interest in photorealism and perspective as an artistic tool and artistic choice, and the quite unique choice and quite unusual choice at the time of working in the medium of tempera that really drew me to Andrew's paintings. And I was very lucky later on in my role as a curator to get to meet, and we have been able to stay in touch.
Yes, absolutely.
When we approached Andrew to ask him to join us for the Unexpected View series, one of the things we always ask the artist is, well, what is the painting that you would like to talk about? What is the painting that you as an artist find relevant, interesting to you at the moment, but also for the for your practice in general? And it was very clear. Andrew said, let's talk about Piero della Francesca. And maybe I'll just start, Andrew. Why this painting? How did you select it, and how have you encountered it for the first time?
Well, thank you first of all for inviting me to talk about the painting. But just the whole challenge of selecting one of the paintings from this collection was like, oh, where am I going to start? You know, and I actually hadn't been into the National Gallery for a couple of years since COVID, and so. But then I thought, well, you know, I was at St Martin's, which was just up the road at the time. It's Charing Cross, and so we were up the road. And we had to come down here to do transcription projects and to do drawings. So I was here every day, and I used to love coming down here. I used to sort of be here twice a week for about 2 years, you know. And so I just had to think back to what was influential at the time. There was probably 2 paintings that still stuck with me that I think are still relevant to my practice. This is obviously one of them. The other one was a Vermeer painting. Now, they just happen to be 2 of the most popular paintings in the National Gallery at the moment. So I was a little bit embarrassed about choosing both the most iconic paintings, thinking I must be a bit more interesting and choose something more obscure. But then I just thought, no, I've got to talk about this. So, and sort of tease out what it is that still stays relevant to my process and my work about Piero.
Maybe very, very quickly, Andrew, how would you describe your work at the moment? How do you describe your practice? What is it that you do when people ask you how you work?
Well, I mean, I start with the scale, the medium. They're the miniatures. You can see them here. Some of these are 10, 15-year-old paintings, but I wouldn't call them realist or photorealist. These are 2 words that might come to mind, but I try and avoid. I often have to tell a story about. I find it useful to think of them as copies of photographs, and that translation from a photograph and everything that goes wrong and is different about them than the photograph is what's relevant. It's not an error. So the notion of copying is really why I am working on the scale I did. I used to go to snappy snaps before digital printouts and make 6x4 prints, because that was the size, or 7x5, and that was the exact size I made the painting. So it was to do with having a rule, an order that eliminated all the other choices that I found myself confronted with. My first, I will quickly tell the story, a little digression, but the first sort of eureka moment in my practice, just after I left the Royal College, because I was painting like, the tutors told me just to stop and think, not just to paint, because I would just every day, every 2 weeks, I had a studio full of a different sort of genre of artworks, still lifes, big Rothko paintings, and completely untutorable because I was doing everything. So when I left, I was very confused. So I kept on painting different styles of paintings for the next 5 or 6 years, and I said to my studio mate, I'm just going to go to the storeroom and take out all my old paintings and make copies of them. And a sort of light bulb went. I said it as a joke, but then I thought, well, I can actually do this. I've got all my old paintings. It looks like this terrible group show. And I brought them into my studio and started making duplicates of them. And that was so fascinating. The whole slowing down the pace. You know, the light was at the end of the tunnel. All I had to do was to get towards there, and then it was finished. And that was such a relief and sort of an interesting prospect. There was no invention at all. It was just following these rules. And maybe there's a parallel with sort of rules and systems in Piero that It's a classical sort of thing that I warm to. But I
But
found
when you say slowing things down, it also makes it a lot about observation.
it all became about observation and translation and misobservation and not seeing things or seeing more than there is, and the sort of uncanny nature of a duplicate and what's authentic. Questions came up that I wasn't addressing before. It was only when I started to copy myself that I actually became authentically me, just sort of paradoxically. And then I discovered that working from photographs was quite fulfilling for me, just copying them one-to-one. And the first set of photographs were photographs I would take of the exhibition space in which I was going to show, which was also at the Whitechapel. When I put a proposal in for the Whitechapel Open, I just said, I'm going to photograph the room and the space where my work's hanging with whatever works are in the room. There was Grace and Perry's and different things. And my painting would just be like a document of the space in which my painting hung. So I didn't even have to think about the content, because the content made itself. Mm-hmm. My painting was always in the middle, and whatever else was in the frame was in the frame. And so, again, it was just this, it solved, how to paint, because I just copied, as best I could be bothered, and then also the content was taken care of, because it was just the rule of the image was in the middle of wherever it was hung. So I carried that on for years. How this relates to Piero might be a bit more of a sort of a stretch, but anyway. But I do remember at St. Martin's coming down to choose a painting, and I didn't choose this to do a transcription of, it's too difficult. So I chose the Mantegna, which is in the next door room, you might want to have a look at it. It's a baptism, another baptism, it's a small painting of St. John the Baptist and the sort of baby Jesus, and Mary's in the corner of the painting. And I was fascinated by that painting because of the pose of the Madonna at the bottom left-hand corner. She's sort of like this, or something like that. And she's sort of staring at her hands and nothing in her hands. And I was really fascinated by that corner, and so I made a transcription of that painting. But it was because there was this void, this emptiness in her pose, and something was wrong about it. It was quite, in a way, surreal, So did a painting of that, but then I researched it later, and I found out that the object that was in her hands they couldn't decide what it was. It had been tampered with over the hundreds of years, so that the recent restorers had just painted the void. And so she might have been holding a scroll or some other symbolic form, but it was just this emptiness which I was really drawn to, this kind of sort of pregnant pause. So you can have a look at that painting. I'm not talking about that painting, but I think there's also something of that frozen, arrested moment and the sort of mystery which, everybody talks about Piero's painting here as containing. But this was one that has stuck with me, and it's just this. I know a lot of people have written about it, so we all have our own relationship to it. I still see people flocking to this and doing all sorts of spiritual things in front of it. It's got this sort of magnetic pull. So where to start with the painting?
What was the first thing that you saw because we also here in the museum we hang it very often on a site axis where people actually walk into a room or approach it from afar. Is that something that you have in your memory when first encountering the painting, or is it the detail that you first
This was
remember?
when it was here, when I was coming in all the time. It was in a room down the corner there, and it was quite a small room, so it didn't have this big build up to it. I think it was on the side wall as well. It was opposite the Nativity. So it wasn't given the dramatic entrance that it has here. When you come in, it's framed within the frame. So it was more the detail and just the sort of stillness and the sort of magnetic pull of it. I mean, that's something that's been talked about, is the sort of this sort of lack of time in it, or the strange sense of time within it, which is kind of unlike any other painting. If you've got the Uccello across there, was painted at the same time, but it's sort of decorative. It's interesting, but it's got no. I mean, it's frozen, but in a way, it's like a casket with inlaid wood or something, isn't it? That's what it reminds me of. It doesn't have the space and this sort of arrested moment, this freeze frame that you get in here, but very particularly. So there's many reasons why I think that is contained in this painting more than any other painting in this gallery, which I can sort of try and talk about. But in relationship to my work, it's actually when I take photographs, particularly for my work, it is that feeling, that arrested sort of like frozen moment in time, as if, I mean, it has a before and after, but it's really plucked out of time. There's a moment when you frame a photograph, and I usually have to take 100 photographs of a room, but I have to look at them afterwards to find this arrested moment that is the feeling that I still see in this image here.
When you're thinking about an arrested moment in painting, but also in photography and in the way that you look at things, are you looking at the notion of the arrested moment as in something has just passed, or something will just happen, or something is in between those two states?
It's definitely in between. It's not like a linear thing connected to the past and the future. Mm-hmm. It's like the moment when a ball is at the top of its flight, you throw it up in the air. It's that moment, and it just seems to last forever. So that's the feeling you have here. There's lots of things going on which will imply that. The arrested, the bird, the holy ghost is arrested in flight. It's not flying, it's not going anywhere. The water is being poured, it's arrested in time. The drapes are like statues. They are not, there's no wind, there's no sort of, like a vacuum of space. There's lots of things words that you could put onto it.
The clouds are even shown as formations that are essentially reflections of themselves and each other. They are not indicating a temporal movement through time. There's no changing weather occurring.
No wind
that alludes towards a change in the future.
Yeah. This is all sort of post deconstructing the painting, but I think you get the sense immediately of this arrested time, and then you can go in to analyze why exactly. But it's also something to do with the ordering of the space and the shapes and the formal qualities of it. But yes, I think it's again, the relevance of coming here when I was a student. It's clear that using the National Gallery as a sort of encyclopedia of imagery, from which you are asked to develop and choose and make distinctions between all the possibilities that are here, was a very useful sort of tool. So I started off, I think when I was at college, it was like Titian was, all the tutors talked about Titian and things, and I looked at Tintoretto, and I even got into Rubens and things, and all that completely, I think it's, and when I found Piero, which was like the antidote to all this, the sort of stillness and the timeless quality as opposed to movement and all the sort of Dionysic, fleshy Rubens thing, it's got its place, but I realized that this is my personality resides within this kind of path that you can take. And, you can from this, like Morandi, because I see Morandi as something like a great-great-grandson of Piero or something. So I also think in Morandi paintings, there might be in a way quite boring conservative paintings. In one respect, I don't see them as that, because I see them as this very, very tight, it's almost, you want to scream. They're so sort of like, they're going to explode. It's just like this, I see them like a bag left in the gallery that might be a bomb. You just look at it and you're just waiting for it to explode.
You use the metaphor of the ball that is suspended in the air. At that moment, when the ball is still in the air, that's where it has the most potential and to come down and rebounds.
It's potential, but you just wait forever for it to happen. And it's not going to happen.
What I find really interesting is that you're essentially describing Pietro in liminal terms, in moments of being on the brink. Yeah. And I can absolutely see that in some of the compositional elements that we have mentioned. I'd like to go into that more and where else you see those. Yeah. But as an art historian, for me, it's also really interesting that, of course, Piero himself was very much a liminal figure in terms of the usage of perspective as a metaphorical form, as a choice by artists to change their way of telling narratives, of telling stories, of representing space in a particular way that was not necessarily just due to a lack of skill prior to somebody like this artist, but actually that was a symbolic form that was being introduced, used, and seen as useful. And Piero himself wrote extensively about perspective. He thought extensively about perspective, and everything we see in this painting is very much a decision and artistic choice. And I think that's fascinating that we see this moment of ambiguity. Is the ball falling or is it still rising? And it gives it that potential.
And it was only 20 years before, and Brunelleschi had formalized perspective, and Piero had seen Brunelleschi's work, and so this was incredibly new. We were talking about this is part of a triptych. This was made as part of a triptych, and I think it's St. Paul and St. Peter on the sides of it were very much like iconic icons that were painted just at the same time, but they had the gold background. And icons are interesting in themselves because they're a form of art that has no time at all. It's like a sacred time. There's no place, there's no time at all. So Piero's was in the middle of these two concurrent paintings, but completely from a different planet. So I mean, and this must have seemed like a piercing of the space in the chapel. I mean, it must have been unbelievable. I mean, you still see it now when it's put back digitally in its original frame. It's like it does not belong there. It's really kind of ridiculous. Looks much better here on its own. So this kind of creating a realistic space, yet holding that realism deliberately, I think, tightly across the surface like a jigsaw puzzle. Was still very important. It's not.
When you look at the painting now, Andrew, where do you see those moments of arrest, those moments of the ball suspended in the air that have this potential of really exciting you as an artist? What are the moments that you see in this painting at this point?
Well, there's all sorts of arrested things. I mean, I remember first being really drawn to this section here. That she looks like a little cubist painting. The reflections, they don't actually match up authentically with the scene behind. But this kind of jigsaw puzzle, as I say, of coloured forms and the spaces between things. I mean, it's like everywhere you look. I mean, I think you could stare for hours at the feet of the angels. You just look at this big toe and it's suddenly sort of looking back at you sort of strangely. The only thing that's actually looking at us is this angel here, but it's that kind of gaze which is looking right through you. It's not really seeing you. It's like they're from another world looking at you, but they can't quite see you. It's like looking through a one-way mirror or something. So, and there's all sorts of gazes going on. There's just all these beautiful negative spaces that I loved. My eye just loves to sort of ponder over. It gives you so much. I mean, even between the legs here, there's a beautiful form, but it's broken up absolutely beautifully. The negative space between John the Baptist, the sky, and Christ's head, strange, sort of very strange shape. And I read recently that's the strange shape of his sleeve they've worked out, it's been painted and mucked around with by Piero. It's not natural. He's gone over it and changed it, particularly to create this negative space. And the V of his chest and the V of this negative space here. That little triangle's beautiful, the hands. I'm looking at it very formally, like a painter, just because I'm sure some of you are painters, artists, you've all tried painting, and when you're making a work, that's what you're thinking about. You're just shifting things ever so slightly. I do that usually in camera, just by moving slightly to get the shapes between things, and then reflect on them afterwards. And there's always one that's got the right. You don't have to analyze it. You just look at the whole. You see that it works. It's got this sort of equation going on, which adds up to zero in a way. It's like a zero-sum equation where nothing's asking to be moved. When you're making a painting, you can. I shift things slightly. So there's a kind of slow, artificial build-up of space and relationships, which obviously Piero is just, I think, the best at. I mean, I really challenge you to see in the gallery anyone that's got this kind of simplicity as well. It's something that he nails it.
When you're looking at paintings like that, what is for you the moment when you can best look at paintings? Is that a contemplative process that you do by yourself? Is it a dialogic process where you have best a conversation partner that you take into an art gallery with you? Is it something that you as a teacher best do when thinking together with students? How do you practically get into that space of thinking about painting?
I think most of it goes on, to be honest, myself, dialogue with myself, which is sometimes when strange when you spurt it out, because you think, what is this? Does anybody else understand this or get this? But I have some artist friends. We go around galleries. So
Yeah.
just the other day, I went with my friend John Greenwood, who's got a very different aesthetic. It's quite Dionysic, and I'm more Apollonian, I suppose. But I really enjoy discussing paintings in the minute detail with an interlocutor like that. It's really interesting. But I think I just understood this. My father was a painter too, and my house was like his museum. It was, you didn't show anywhere else, but the house was a museum, and his paintings had, he used to paintings of Arbroath Harbour. But honestly, I think this is also reminiscent of some of his paintings. This sort of period of the early 20s, 1940s, 50s. He was painting in these sort of blocky jigsaw puzzle way. So that's probably deep inside my own psyche with my conversation with my father in a way. But and I'm sure he would approve of this. But yes, it's more. It's just these days of sort of walking around the gallery that really sort of embedded it in. But as I said, it was this suddenly eureka moment of deciding that the quiet, the still, rather than the spectacular and the sort of theatrical, in a sense of like a Rubens or something, would be the kind of I think it's true of my work. My work are very clear, very sort of drawn in a way. They're sort of drawing is the priority over painting, which I think you could see in Piero.
I think some of the things that I see in your work and when people talk about Piero is this moment that we now in the 20th, 21st century very often describe as the photographic quality of it. And you've already mentioned that in your personal work, you very often work from photographs, or that you create photographs first, which then get translated into painting. So I'm just trying to identify how we relate to what we call that photographic quality of painting, the arrest, the moment of stillness, the kind of slowing things down, how we can perhaps relate that to also photographic traditions. I'm thinking of Roland Barthes and his idea in the Camera Lucida about the punctum, which is what he essentially called the ball in the air, the moment of inaction before the action or right after the action, that moment of ambiguity that imbues the thing with enormous potential. And that is something that is essentially a photographic mode, even though we retroactively attribute that to a painting here. But it's this moment of tremendous import when the divinity of Christ is revealed in the moment of baptism and is announced. We see it here. Am I overdoing it, or is this something that resonates with you?
No, absolutely. This is sort of, as I was, preparing for this, I read, there's a book by Darian Leader called The Stealing of the Mona Lisa, which I thought was some way, I haven't quite worked out relevant to this. There's the moment when the Mona Lisa was taken away, crowds flocked to see the empty space in the Louvre and the sort of absence that drew the crowd. And he says that the history of art could be seen as new ways to evoke the history of what is absent in an image, or what's the absence that draws us towards it. So I think this kind of, to some degree, if I could push the metaphor, Christ himself acts, another reference, it's way above my sort of pay grade, but Lacan talks about a similar thing about little object A is a sort of something from the real world that plugs the gap in our understanding of our consciousness. So there's always a sort of gap. And I think, if you're religious, you're aware of a mystery, but you don't know how to describe it. So what do? You manifest it by a man with a beard who's from this world. But this is the moment when the man with the beard becomes Jesus Christ. He becomes a sort of spectral quality or a sort of religious powers bestowed upon him. And he himself, this kind of, there's something in this that we're gazing at him. He's got this internal sort of calm about him. But I think in terms of the subject evoking this feeling that I'm talking about, I think it might not be an accident that it's this moment of baptism, which has parallels with replacing this gap, this void, this punctum, this sort of moment, this puncturing, with something which is, in this case, Jesus Christ. But in the past, I've thought about UFOs. I was really obsessed with UFO photographs. I know that's a bit of a off-piste, but something about, in Barthian terms, the sort of photographs of UFOs where it's a very banal landscape, but the UFO changes the whole thing into some sort of other significance, other stories, supernatural things come into it, And I've always been really fascinated by that, how the banal can become,
Maybe in that context, my last question that I already have, in terms of the moment of stillness and of arrest, is something that takes time or that deals with time, and the manufacturing of your work in particular is quite different from the photograph as something that happens in an instant. You work in tempera. It takes a lot of time. Piero works in tempera. Can you maybe very, very quickly summarize the technique and then how you think about this painting in terms of tempera as a process, not so much as a technique?
Yeah, so I use the same technique as Piero here, but so I wasn't aware of that when I first looked at them, and I wasn't using tempera then, but now in retrospect I look and I can see that the tempera, it dries very quickly.
It's pigment dissolved in egg.
It's pigment dissolved in egg yolk. To put it simply, there's different ways of doing it, but essentially it's pigment and egg yolk, and it dries instantaneously, and it has a particular brilliance to the color, but of course it depends on the quality of the pigments, etc. You paint on a gesso ground. So it's very difficult. The difficulty with tempera is modulating tone. Means you've got to paint every individual tone as if it was the last thing you painted. You can't sort of glaze, you can't sort of mix it with white to sort of and feather it to get it sort of modulating from dark to light. You have to paint you have to mix every single tone and paint every single tone. So you spend a lot of time working through tonal shifts. And I'm sure this is why. For example, I was always fascinated as well with the light on the chest of Christ here, and just the nipples and the modulation of his muscles, and it's incredibly subtle. It's of a tonal range which goes from 78% bright to 81%. It's stuck in that tonal range. You get darks, but you don't get anything too dark in this painting. But each object that he's painting, which he has to paint individually, has its own tonal range, and it's very, very narrow, unusually narrow. When you look around at, say, your cello, there's a much broader tonal range. Something beautiful about the qualities of keeping within a few percentage, especially when you look over the shadows under the arms of Christ are hardly defined at all. You imagine them there, but they're hardly there, and and you can and as you're going from dark to light, which is what you do in tempera, so you're adding little bits of white with a bit of color in it to make it yellowy or whatever, and you get this lovely modulation. You can always go a little bit further and pick out a lovely little bit of highlight just on the lip or something. I think you get just on the lips or the nose of the angels there, you can see he's just pushing it a little bit further towards these highlights.
And are these tonal shifts something that have to be premeditated, or do you decide them in the moment, or how does those decisions?
A lot of it will be as you're doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, you start with the dark. So he's, if you were doing the chest, if he was painting the chest, he would maybe do that in a few days, but you would start with the shadows, but there's not really a very dark shadow, as you can see, and then you just work your way towards the highlight on the... It
does almost sound like a meditative process that you're describing.
It is, and there's time contained in the process, which is entirely visible. Everything you see is the time that it was put on. It's not like glazed afterwards, or it's not layering in that sense. It's just this jigsaw puzzle you work around. A fresco is similar but different. You do section to section, and as you're spending so much time on an area, you create this artificial sort of tightness of forms and tonal relationships. You can see it on the dresses here. Really enjoyed, must have putting the highlights on there, but they're very similar to the darks. They're not that much tonal difference, and it creates a strange ethereal quality. It looks like velvet or something, but something unnatural about it. And that's the technique which he's playing with. Whether in today's terms, whether he thought it was sort of strange in the way that I'm describing it, I don't know, but it definitely is why this quality is so easily achieved. And even the modulation of the trunk of the tree. You can see all the thousands of little tiny strokes. So there's no big decisions. The drawing would be the main thing, and then you're coloring in, basically, which is what I do. But you're coloring in a very specific time-based way. And there's writers like David Josler who talks about paintings being like a battery, like the potential, all the energy, the time invested by the artist. As you stand in front of it and scan over the picture, you sort of unlock or you tap into that battery. You see all the decisions unfold. They're there all at once, but I think it's quite a nice way of thinking about paintings as a battery, and this is a battery with a lot of power. It's a lot of individual decisions.
And it's a battery that's 600 years old.
Yes.
And for it to have still that draw, that pull, that energy, that moment of arrest and potential for artists and for visitors today, I think is something that explains to me at least why it has such a pull on me, but also on so many artists today.
Yeah, it's a mystery. It's a real full mystery that you just don't get. Even though it's quite simple, it seems it's never you never get to anywhere near the bottom of it. Which is I think why it's one of the most popular paintings, and it's all types of people are drawn to it. So it's a sort of special magnet, as it were.
I think that's probably a very, very poignant moment to stop, to end on, exactly. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thank
pleasure.
you very much for spending your time with us. We hope we can see you again soon.
Yeah.
And please enjoy the rest of the evening in the galleries. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.